Yemima and Cedric and Ronen and Amir and Irene and Paul and all the unnamed ones who have contributed to this being a very interesting and a very well organized symposium. And I want to declare that this is an all-Finnish session except for Vered, and which is noteworthy also because Buber actually made an effort to learn the language for reasons that will become clear during my paper. And you should know that it's not an easy language to learn unless you're fortunate to be born into it, like Lena and myself. It's rather hard. So it's an important component of understanding Buber. I'll try to ask questions about that rather than answer any answers. The early pre-Ishundu Buber was particularly invested for several years in the search of meaning in the realm of literature, specifically in literature that bears the marks of mythical discourses. This paper will point at some of the dialogical potentials in a Finnish mythical text that Buber was apparently not aware at that stage. So I shall emphasize the relevance of a gender perspective for interpreting those dialogical potentials. And I shall, so to say, look at the pre-Ishundu Buber with the eyes of a post-Ishundu Buber, if I am allowed. The genre of myth provides, is in the spirit of Claude Lévi-Strauss's work. Myths are underlying structures of thinking that generate or have a strong influence on modes of behavior and creativity in their respective communities. They provide a conceptual and ethical basis for the norms and values of the societies in which they have emerged. Furthermore, I suggest that myths serve as imaginative, narrative arenas to search for meanings regarding the most incomprehensible events of human life, on a personal as well as on a collective level. In 1912, Martin Buber published in the magazine Literarische Echo the essay Kalevala das finnische Epos, Kalevala the Finnish Epic, as reported in the volume of his collected works titled Myth and Mysticism. The essay was republished as the Nachwort, the afterword, of the 1914 edition of Anton Schiefner's German translation of the Finnish epic Kalevala. That was first published, the translation was first published in 1852 under the title Kalevala das Nationalepos der Finnen, 3 years after having been compiled and authored in Finnish by Elias Lönnroth in 1849. This is the version that has since then become more or less canonized and translated into over 200 languages. Kalevala is the country of the main heroes of the epic, the mythical ancestors of the Finns who were part of creation, such as the blacksmith Ilmarinen, who forged the sky, and Väinämöinen, the great sorcerer who first cultivated the earth. Lönnroth, the compiler, was a significant actor in the cultural revival characterizing the Finnish national movement in the 19th century. His work was inspired by both internal developments and continental activities among enlighteners and national romantics alike. In the Kalevala, he integrated various versions of orally performed epic poems into a narrative entity of 50 cantos. The oral poetry was recorded in writing by Lönnroth himself and by others, collected while roaming in the northeastern borderlands of Finland, and then archived at the University of Helsinki, serving as the laboratory of the young discipline of folk literary scholarship. Unlike most of the other participants in this conference, Buber is not nearly the bread and butter of my scholarly work. Yes, I have been inspired by his political vision regarding the two peoples inhabiting the space between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, a land of two peoples according to his formulation. Indeed, I have long and in vain hoped that this formulation will wholeheartedly be adopted by the governments of both nations, and what is perhaps even more important, by the two peoples themselves. The struggle that especially today and in the last months is occurring here is about this vision, as much as about anything else, and to my view, much more. I have also found his focus, Buber's focus, on the concept of dialogue fruitful for textual as well as cultural interpretation. Buber interwove his discussion of dialogue in predominantly theological and ethical discourses. Possibly, like for the late Buber, my ethical stand towards dialogue has been animated by the political situation in this land, developing in parallel as a firm basis for textual analysis and interpretation. The latter, I'm on purpose resisting the commonplace today that saying that something is political makes it dirty. Possibly like for the latter aspect was foregrounded while I addressed oral literatures of the diverse cultures and languages composing Israel and Palestine. I'll explain. The eliciting of oral repertoires is accomplished in an emphatically dialogical interview situation, very often characterized by great differences, social, cultural, and other, initially separating interviewer and interviewee. The methods applied in those dialogical events have, with many necessary adaptations, also served my study of folk narratives in the late antique rabbinic texts that were mentioned just now, the Talmudim and the Midrashim. With the gently persuasive guidance of my friend Paul Mendes-Flohr, I have been enchanted into Buber's early and quite intense involvement with texts of mythical character encompassing especially the worlds of China, India, and Finland. However, in the matter of Buber, I'm the hedgehog rather than the fox of the parable. Born and partly educated in Finland and in my earliest years introduced to Finnish folklore and mythology, as well as having studied it at the University of Helsinki, I have in the last years undertaken, as was mentioned, the calling to create the first full-fledged poetic translation of this major culture, treasure of the Finns into Hebrew. Buber's discussion exhibits a perplexing silence on the female figures in the Kalevala text and in its mythical world, a silence that appears to lead to a failure to conceive of the full dialogical potentials of Finnish mythical poetry. Historically, this failure is of course explained by the early stage in Buber's thinking, as his work on myth developed in the first 1.5 decade of the 20th century, long before the exposition of his dialogical thought in Ishildu. It would be interesting to hear how you, real Buber experts, appraise the possible impact of Buber's interest in myth, a particularly dialogic genre to my mind, on the development of his dialogical thought in general. And I think I had heard something in Bettina Banash's mention of Herder that might be a red thread leading into this problematic, that I'm interested if we can follow it. I suggest that the dialogical potential of myths is embodied in the stark contrasts and their powerful symbolical representations in the mythical texts, life and death, culture and nature, old and young, and yes, male and female. The narrative mechanism of myths moves these contrasts through series of transformations, leading them into temporary negotiations, mediations, and balances that create the dialogical relations between binary opposites. Levi Strauss at my back. Thus, the supposedly contrasted conceptualizations of male and female are negotiated, mediated, and balanced in numerous instances in the epic poems amalgamated by Lönnrot in the Kalevala. This mediation, especially of the binary of male and female as it exists in the Kalevala, and even more in the oral sources from which the epic has been mined, is, however, all but lost in Buber's magnificent tribute. This omission can be discerned especially on two levels, one contextual, the other intertextual. The contextual omission is expressed in Buber's reification of the hypostatized character of the epic singer, whom he calls by the Finnish term laulaja, with a capital L. The capital L may, of course, be explained by the convention of German orthography regarding all nouns. However, Buber's choice of a single, almost abstract personification results in a contrived, idealized individuality of the singer that totally contradicts the social reality of Finnish epic singing, performed by a host of performers whose names adorn the records at the archives of the Finnish Literature Society, most of which have also been bound in a 39 volumes work. The term laulaja, in and by itself, does not determine the gender of the singers, but the German language compels Buber to reveal his prejudice by calling the singer he. However, unlike some other epic traditions, presumably, according to historical reconstructions, the Greek Homeric epic singing, for instance, was sung or were sung by male singers and perhaps also for a predominantly male audience. Finnish epic singing, however, was conspicuously gender inclusive. In fact, as a student, I was fortunate to attend a performance during a field trip to Karelia in eastern Finland in September 1969, most of you weren't born, where a female performer sang the epic lines in the traditional tune. She was one of the last active singers of the locally situated East Finnish singers. Since then, the tradition has been revitalized and deterritorialized, moved from the countryside periphery to the urban centers and to established art stages. In the Kalevala itself, the male figures are more often active as singers of magic charms, by which they destroy, bewitch, or conjure up inanimate as well as animate creatures. Some women, such as the powerful adversary of the Kalevala folks, Louhi, mistress of the north, also excels in sorcery. But elsewhere in the text, women mostly perform socially functional songs, such as detailed songs preparing the departure of the young bride from her home, enumerating her tasks and the hard life she will have in married life. This genre is in Finnish included in the genre of laments. Laments are sung to the dead, of course, to men departing for war, and yes, for brides leaving their childhood homes. These texts are no diversions in the epic. They introduce the ethnographic fullness and concrete detail of everyday life and social reality. In this too, the Kalevala differs from the Homeric model of the Indo-European epic. Kalevala's gender economy in the text reinforces the cultural association of women and the quotidian, and the female presence in the domestic microcosm, unlike the male dominance in the political, bellicose, and cosmic spheres. And we have been reminded of this aspect and its sensitivity with regard to Buber in several papers at this conference. I won't remember everything, but Noah Avron Barak's paper when she talked about art and craft, and that's why I was so interested. It was quoted from Pappenheim by Abigail Gilman when Pappenheim says the everyday, right? And of course, The letters that were read by Tamar Goldschmidt and Heike Breitenbach this morning brought it into stark light. And also the moving passage about trivialities that Paul mentioned in the morning, the trivialities, right? So here we have a whole cosmos of femininity. Significantly, the magnificent poetic Hebrew translation of Shaul Chernichovsky, comprising circa 25% of the Kalevala and translated from the Russian, contains almost none of this quotidian material, emphasizing also the poet-translator's adherence to the Homeric model as befits one who also translated the two Greek epics into Hebrew. Buber too seems to downplay the domestic and quotidian parts of the Kalevala, rather expressing his appreciation of what Northrop Frye long ago coined as the high mimetic and heroic modes of representation. Since Paul had this promiscuous relationship with this microphone, I have to...
That is a nice reminder.
Excuse me, Paul. I was very visible and audible. Buber too seems to downplay the domestic and quotidian parts of the Kalevala, rather expressing his appreciation of what Northrop Frye long ago coined as the high mimetic and heroic modes of representation of reality that by no means are the only modes of representation characteristic of the Kalevala. Note that the domestic and female modes of representation are fully adequate in epic poetry that was performed in the combined kitchen and living room space of the Finnish country home, the tupa, where multi-gendered and multi-generational interactions, public as well as private, took place, not in the king's salon like the reconstructions of the Greek epics tell us. In the Kalevala epic and even more in its oral sources, the subject of the experiences conveyed is not the abstract male laulaya, remember from the beginning, but rather a multivocal, diverse group of singers and audiences. Myth is narrated not outside the sphere of the everyday experiential world, but rather as a communicative and expressive mode of existence in its heart, at its heart. Buber, who assumed that Leonard's work was animated by a belief in the unity of an ancient epic telling of an ur-myth, was aware, in the sense of 19th century mythological research, he was aware that Buber was thus aware of the multiple, he was aware of the multiple distribution of runo singing. Runo is the Finnish word for this kind of poetry, although he seems not to have been aware of the fact that women as well as men actively sang. Interestingly, Buber also projected the person of the laulaya on the author-compiler Lönnrot. The intratextual gender, this was the contextual, the singing and all that. The intratextual gender dialogic potential present in the Kalevala is embedded in the numerous strong, articulate and active women figures, such as Louhi the sorceress, leader of the people of the north, who are the enemies of Kalevala, whom I already mentioned, the mother of wanton lover boy figure Lemminkainen, who enters the kingdom of death to successfully, do I kill this?
Maybe eventually you will have to use that one.
I'll move to that one. I'll just clean that one too. I don't know who interacted.
Clean it a little bit.
Okay. Much less convenient, but yes.
Is it okay?
Yes. Do you hear me? That's the main thing. Yeah. So also the mother of wanton lover boy figure Lemminkainen, who enters the kingdom of death to successfully resuscitate her son, and at the very beginning of the work, the cosmic lady of the air, Ilmatar, who both gives birth to the foremost Kalevala hero, singer and sorcerer Väinämöinen, as well as serves as the incubator for the cosmic egg laid by the mythical bird, an egg whose subsequent breaking produces the stars, the moon, the sun, and the earth itself. True, the Lady of the Air is rather passive in the process, but it is her fatal move of the knee, heated up by the egg being hatched in her bosom, that triggers creation. This is maybe not as powerful a potential for dialogical gender constructions in the epic as the performance by both genders, but the combination of both is noteworthy. The context of national ideology, as processed by the young Buber, is in the first decade of the 20th century, resonates in his Kalevala Nachtwort. This tone may be less pertinent for his work on Chinese and Indian mythical texts, for reasons that are quite clear, but I don't want to discuss them now, than for the Finnish epic. That was indeed created in the nest of European nationalism. The complexity of many views of early Zionism between nationalism and universalist enlightenment may thus be revealed even in this text of Buber, and I think it is a tension that goes through his work and maybe through Zionism in general. I shall conclude with some brief observations about the threads connecting Buber's Kalevala Nachtwort with his major investment in another project, the translation of the Hebrew Bible together with Franz Rosenzweig. From what I have read, I've learned that, for example, in parallel to the concept of Ikra in the Quran and Quranic interpretive traditions, from the same root as the word Mikra in Hebrew for the Bible, Buber and Rosenzweig tried to convey in parallel to that concept, by their translation, a sense of the spoken revelation, maybe at Sinai, with the echo chamber of the Jewish oral interpretive traditions embedded in post-biblical Jewish literatures. They thus propose their translation as a negotiation between the audial orality of Sinai, the strict written canonicity of Hebrew scripture, traditional oralities related to it, incorporating the contemporary orality of the German Jewish community of the kind that was supposed to be its audience, as well as German literary traditions, while Luther's translation served as a basis for dissimilation. I may have been drawn to Buber and Rosenzweig's Bible translation under the powerful impression of, as I said, translating for the last 3 years, the Kalevala into Hebrew. At the same time, the mythical experience of the undecipherable aspects of the world, as formulated by Buber in the Nachtwort, presents in and by itself a challenge for the translatability between experience or of experience into text. The practice of translation, for which several German Jewish thinkers such as Rosenzweig and Benjamin offered most interesting thoughts that I cannot discuss here and now, opens up a discussion of translatability that may set some points for the further discussion of texts of mythical experience. Freud and Wittgenstein come to mind, but here I must conclude. Thank you.